Tonight, we've got a tale for you about the darkest corners of the West, about a night of terror and an act of impossible courage. It's a story about a ghost who walks in the darkness and the 3 women he saved, only to vanish like a whisper on the wind. It's a real mystery, the kind that gets told around campfires for generations. The town of Perdition was aptly named. It wasn't a place you found on any respectable map. It was a place you stumbled into when you were running from something flawed, a debt, or your own damn soul. It clung to the scorched earth of the Arizona territory like a festering scab, a collection of clapboard saloons, rickety storefronts, and adobe huts baking under a sun that offered no mercy. The wind that blew through its single, dusty street didn't carry the scent of pine or sage, but the reek of cheap whiskey, and washed bodies, and despair. Perdition was the last stop for the lost, and the first stop for the damned. At its rotten core was the livestock auction yard, a place where the livestock sometimes walked onto legs. Tonight, the yard was ablaze with torchlight, the flickering flames casting long, grotesque shadows against the high wooden fences. A rough crowd of miners, outlaws, and hard-faced ranchers had gathered, their faces a gallery of greed and casual cruelty. They jostled and spat, their pockets heavy with ill-gotten gains, all waiting for the evening's main event. Presiding over the affair from a raised platform was Silas the Vulture Croft. He was a man whose physical appearance perfectly matched his reputational and gaunt, with a hunched posture and a long, hooked nose that gave him a predatory, avian look. He dressed in a dusty black suit that was a size too big, making him seem like a scarecrow stuffed with malice instead of straw. His voice, a gravelly cackle that scraped the air, echoed across the yard. "All right, settle down, you heathens," Croft crowed, spreading his long, bony hands. "We've dispensed with the 4-legged beasts. Now, for the real treasures of the evening. Rarities, I assure you, plucked fresh from the wilderness for your consideration." A lecherous wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. Behind Croft, a crude wooden cage held the treasures. 3 women, chained at the ankle, huddled together, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and defiant resolve. They were a study in contrasts, a trinity of stolen lives. Alara Vance was the first to be dragged from the cage. A month ago, she had been a schoolteacher in a small, hopeful settlement 100 miles east. She had come west with a heart full of books and a belief in the power of education to tame the frontier. Then the bandits had come, burning her schoolhouse, killing the men who tried to defend it, and dragging her into a nightmare. Her dress, once a respectable gray cotton, was torn and filthy. Her auburn hair, usually tied in a neat bun, was a wild, tangled mess. But it was her eyes that held you. They were the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths, the fear was overshadowed by a sharp, calculating intelligence. She did not plead or cry. She watched the crowd with a look of such profound contempt it was almost a physical blow. "First up, a piece of Eastern civility," Croft announced, yanking her chain. "Got some fire in her. This one, educated, they say, can probably read and write, if any of you boys are looking for a clever servant to keep your books." Next came Maria. She was young, barely 18, with skin the color of warm cinnamon and eyes as dark and deep as a desert night. Her village, a small farming community south of the border, had been raided by Croft's men. She wore the remnants of a brightly embroidered peasant blouse and skirt, the vibrant colors now faded and stained. And like Alara's quiet defiance, Maria's was a simmering volcano. Her chin was held high, her fists were clenched, and her glare was a silent promise of retribution. She spat on the ground near Croft's boots, a small act of rebellion that earned her a vicious cuff across the face. She stumbled but didn't fall, her hatred a palpable force. "A little wildcat from south of the line," Croft sneered, wiping his hand on his trousers. "Spirited, for those of you who enjoy a challenge. Guaranteed to make your hacienda a little more lively." The last was Sarah. She was the youngest, perhaps only 16, and she seemed as fragile as a desert wildflower. She was the sole survivor of a homestead attack, her family slaughtered before her eyes. The trauma had wrapped itself around her like a shroud, rendering her almost mute. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt, her simple homespun dress hanging off her gaunt frame. She trembled, her wide, cornflower blue eyes darting back and forth, seeing not the jeering faces of the crowd, but the ghosts of the horrors she had endured. Yet, beneath the terror, there was a flicker of something else, a deep, animalistic instinct for survival that had kept her alive this long. And this one a blank slate, Croft said, his voice taking on a softer, more sinister tone. A true flower of the prairie. Quiet, biddable, ready to be taught the ways of her new home. What am I bid for this prairie rose? The bidding began, a grotesque ritual of shouted numbers and crude jests. Alara, Maria, and Sarah stood on the block, stripped of their names, their pasts, their very humanity, reduced to mere objects to be bought and sold. Alara memorized the faces in the crowd, her mind working furiously, searching for any weakness, any possibility of escape, however slim. Maria met the gaze of every bidder, her eyes burning with a silent curse. Sarah simply retreated into herself, a small, cold place where the monsters couldn't reach her. The bidding was fierce. The women were sold one by one to men with cold eyes and cruel smiles. A silver-haired saloon owner bought Alara, a brutish rancher with hands like slabs of meat bought Maria, and a squinty-eyed miner with a nervous twitch bought Sarah. As the final gavel fell, a sense of absolute finality settled over them. The last ember of hope died, leaving only the cold ash of despair. They were herded into a small, windowless adobe shed behind the auction yard to await their new masters. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and a thick bar was dropped into place, plunging them into near total darkness. The air was thick with the smell of stale fear. For a long moment, the only sound was Sarah's quiet, broken sobs. Then, Alara moved. She fumbled in the darkness until her hand found Sarah's shoulder. "Don't," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the despair. "Don't give them your tears. It's all we have left to keep." Maria, her back against the rough adobe wall, let out a shaky breath. "She is right," she whispered in Spanish, then switched to halting English. "We are not things. We are not animals." In that shared darkness, a fragile alliance was forged. They were no longer just three captured women. They were Alara, Maria, and Sarah. And they were still alive. Outside, the sounds of the drunken crowd began to fade as the men of perdition collected their winnings and their property and stumbled off into the night. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the yard, broken only by the lonely howl of a distant coyote. The moon, a cold, indifferent sliver, rose over the jagged peaks of the Dragon Mountains, watching over the town where the devil did his business. And in the deep shadows beyond the torchlight, something else was watching too. A figure as silent and as patient as stone, a ghost in the darkness, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The darkness inside the shed was a living thing. It pressed in on them, thick and suffocating, amplifying every sound, frantic beating of their own hearts, the whisper of their ragged breathing, the soft, helpless sound of Sarah's weeping. Time stretched and warped, each minute an eternity. They were adrift in a sea of blackness, waiting for the inevitable, horrible moment when the bar on the door would be lifted and their new lives as property would begin. Maria began to pray, her words a soft, rapid stream of Spanish, a familiar comfort in a world gone mad. Alara, ever the pragmatist, felt her way along the rough adobe walls, searching for any crack, any weakness, any splinter of hope in the solid construction. She found nothing. The shed was a tomb. Suddenly, a sound from outside cut through the night. It wasn't the drunken stumbling of a man coming to claim them. It was a soft, guttural thump, like a heavy sack of grain being dropped in the dust. It was followed by a choked-off gasp and then silence. The women froze, their breath catching in their throats. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before Alara or Maria could answer, another sound came, closer this time. A faint shink of metal scraping softly against leather, followed by the lightest of footsteps, a sound so quiet it was more felt than heard, like the tread of a stalking cat. These were not the heavy, clumsy steps of the brutes who had imprisoned them. This was something else entirely. A low, guttural cry of alarm was suddenly cut short just outside their door. There was a brief, violent scuffle, a wet, sickening sound, and then the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. Silence descended again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was charged, predatory. Inside the shed, the air crackled with a new kind of fear, one laced with a thread of bewildered hope. Who was out there? What was happening? Were their captors turning on each other in some drunken squabble? The heavy bar on the outside of the door began to move. It didn't scrape or screech as it had when their captors had slammed it shut. It was lifted with a slow, deliberate smoothness and almost unnerving quiet. The door creaked open a few inches, allowing a single sliver of pale moonlight to pierce the oppressive darkness. The women scrambled back, pressing themselves against the far wall, their hearts hammering against their ribs. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was tall and lean, but moved with a fluid, coiled power that was immediately apparent. It was not one of the lurching, pot-bellied men from the ocean. The figure stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him, plunging them back into near darkness. But their eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, could just make out his shape. He was bare-chested, his skin seeming to absorb the faint light. His face was a terrifying mask of black and white paint, abstract patterns that erased his features and transformed him into a primal spirit of the night. He wore only a leather breechcloth and soft moccasins that had allowed him to move with such impossible silence. A long strand of dark hair, adorned with a single eagle feather, fell across his shoulder. He was an Apache. Sarah let out a small, terrified gasp. They had all heard the storiest whispers of Apache ghosts who raided without warning, who were masters of stealth and sudden, brutal violence. The warrior stood perfectly still for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening to something they couldn't hear. He seemed to be less a man of flesh and blood, and more a piece of the night itself, a shadow given form. The only light was the faint glint of the moon on the long-bladed knife he held in his hand. He moved then, not towards them, but towards the chains that bound their ankles. He knelt, and with a series of deft, precise movements that spoke of long practice, he used a small, sharp piece of stone or metal from a pouch at his waist to work the locks. Ilara watched, mesmerized, as he picked the crude iron lock on her shackle. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the faint, earthy scent of sage and sweat that clung to him. His hands were steady and sure, his focus absolute. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. In less than a minute, the lock clicked open, and the heavy iron fell away from her ankle. He moved to Maria, then to Sarah, repeating the process with the same silent, unnerving efficiency. Not once did he look at their faces. Not once did he speak a word. His attention was solely on the task of freeing them. When the last shackle fell from Sarah's ankle, he stood. He took a step back, and for the first time, he seemed to look at them, though in the darkness, with his features obscured by pain, it was impossible to read his expression. His gaze was intense, piercing, like that of a hawk. He held out the long knife he carried, offering it to them hilt first. Ilara, her mind racing to make sense of the impossible situation, was the one who reached out and took it. The handle was warm from his grip, wrapped in worn leather, and felt solid and real in her trembling hand. It was a weapon. It was a chance. The warrior then raised a hand and pointed, a single, commanding gesture, towards the open doorway and beyond, to the dark, jagged silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains on the horizon. The message was clear: go, run, disappear into the mountains. And then, as silently and as mysteriously as he had appeared, he was gone. He didn't walk out the door so much as melt back into the shadows from which he came. One moment he was there, a terrifying, powerful presence. The next, the doorway was empty. The entire encounter had lasted no more than 5 minutes. It felt like a fever dream. For a moment, the three women were too stunned to move. Ilara clutched the knife, its weight a shocking reality. Maria crossed herself, whispering a prayer of thanks. Sarah was simply staring at the empty doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. A distant shout from the main street of perdition broke the spell. Someone had found the bodies of the guards. He wants us to run, Ilara said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Now. She didn't have to say it twice. They scrambled out of the shed and into the cool night air. The auction yard was a scene of silent carnage. 2 guards lay in the dust near the shed, their throats cut with brutal precision. A third lay slumped near the gate. There was surprisingly little blood. The kills had been swift, clean, and utterly final. Without a backward glance, the 3 women fled. They ran from the torchlight, from the shouts, from the hell that was perdition. They ran towards the dark promise of the mountains, their lungs burning, their bare feet pounding on the hard, rocky ground. They were free, saved by a ghost in the darkness, an Apache warrior who had appeared like a spirit of vengeance, freed them from their chains, and then vanished, leaving behind only 3 dead bodies and a mystery as deep and as vast as the desert night. The flight from perdition was a frantic, desperate scramble fueled by pure adrenaline. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest, until the hateful glow of the town was a faint smudge on the horizon behind them. They didn't stop until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, revealing the stark, brutal beauty of the landscape they had entered. They were in the low foothills of the Drogden Mountains, a world of jagged rocks, thorny mesquite, and towering saguaro cacti that stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels. The ground was a treacherous carpet of loose gravel and sharp stones that tore at their bare feet. The air was thin and dry, and as the sun climbed higher, it brought with it a suffocating, oppressive heat. The freedom that had seemed so exhilarating in the cool darkness of the night now felt terrifyingly precarious. They had escaped the cage only to find themselves in a larger, more dangerous prison with no bars and no walls. They collapsed in the meager shade of a rocky outcrop, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Sarah, her face streaked with dirt and tears, began to shiver despite the growing heat, the shock of their ordeal finally setting in. Maria, ever practical, tore a strip from the hem of her already tattered skirt and began to clean a nasty cut on Sarah's foot. Alara, clutching the Apache's knife, took stock of their situation, her teacher's mind automatically trying to impose order on the chaos. "We need water," she said, her voice hoarse, her throat as dry as sandpaper. "And we need to find shelter from the sun before it gets any higher." Her words, calm and rational, seemed to cut through the haze of fear. For the first time, the 3 women truly looked at each other, not as fellow prisoners, but as partners in a desperate struggle for survival. Their differences were stark. Alara, the educated woman from the east, whose knowledge of the wilderness came from books and lectures. Maria, the daughter of the desert, whose understanding of the land was instinctual, passed down through generations. Sarah, the homesteader's child, who possessed a quiet, practical knowledge of making do and surviving hardship. It was Maria who spoke first. "There," she said, pointing a slender finger towards a line of pale green foliage in the distance. "Where you see the cottonwoods, the willows, there is water. Awash. Maybe it is dry, but maybe not." Her certainty gave them a renewed sense of purpose. They set off again, their pace slower now, more deliberate. Alara used the knife to cut strips from her own dress to create makeshift bandages for their bleeding feet. Sarah, despite her youth and trauma, showed an unexpected resilience. She spotted a barrel cactus and remembered her father telling her that in the most desperate of times, the pulp inside could provide a small amount of moisture. With the knife, they hacked it open, the watery, fibrous pulp a bitter but life-saving relief. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They found the wash just as Maria had predicted. It was mostly dry, a wide, sandy scar on the landscape, but in one shaded bend, a small pool of murky water had collected. They fell upon it like starving animals, scooping the precious liquid into their hands, heedless of the dirt or the taste. It was the most delicious thing any of them had ever tasted. Their immediate thirst quenched, they rested in the shade of the cottonwood trees. The initial euphoria of their escape had worn off, replaced by the grim reality of their predicament. They were 3 women, alone, with no food, no proper shoes, and only a single knife for protection. They were being hunted, they had no doubt of that. The men from perdition would not simply let their valuable property disappear. Friction began to surface, born of fear and exhaustion. "We should have stayed hidden closer to the town," Alara argued, her voice tight with anxiety. "We could have found a way to steal a horse, some supplies, and be caught by morning," Maria retorted, her dark eyes flashing. "No, the mountains are our only chance. This is Apache land. They know how to hide here. The men from the town, they do not." "The Apache," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with the ingrained fear of a settler child raised on tales of brutal raids. "The man who freed us, he was an Apache. What if we find more of them? What will they do to us?" The question hung in the hot, still air. Their mysterious rescuer was both their savior and a representative of a people they had been taught to fear. He had freed them, but he had also abandoned them, pointing them towards a wilderness that seemed just as intent on killing them as Silas Croft had been. "He gave us this," Laura said quietly, holding up the knife. "He didn't harm us. He pointed us this way for a reason." As the day wore on, they were forced to rely on each other's disparate knowledge. Alara, remembering a passage from a book on botany, identified a mesquite tree, its beans edible if properly prepared. Sarah, recalling how her mother used to make dew, showed them how to use the sharp edge of a rock to grind the tough beans into a coarse and appetizing, but nourishing meal. Maria, using an instinct she couldn't explain, found a small seep in the rock face, a source of cleaner water than the stagnant pool in the wash. They were learning to work together, their individual strengths beginning to mesh into a single, functional unit. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a new danger presented itself. The sky to the west grew dark, clear, heavy, and electric. The distant rumble of thunder echoed through the canyons. "Flash flood," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the darkening wash. "We have to get to high ground. Now." She didn't have to explain. They all knew the stories of the desert's sudden, violent tempers. A dry wash could become a raging torrent in minutes. They scrambled up the rocky side of the canyon, their muscles screaming in protest. Just as a low roar began to build in the distance, they reached a high ledge moments before a wall of muddy, churning water, filled with debris and uprooted trees, thundered down the wash where they had been resting only minutes before. Huddled together on the ledge, soaked by the sudden downpour, they watched the raw, terrifying power of the flood. They had survived another test. The unforgiving land had tried to kill them, and they had survived. They were no longer just a teacher, a peasant, and a homesteader. They were survivors. And as the storm passed and the stars began to appear in the freshly washed sky, a new, steely resolve began to form in their hearts. The wilderness was a cruel and impartial enemy. But the human enemy that was surely following them would be far, far worse. Silas the Vulture Croft stood in the pre-dawn gloom of the auction yard and surveyed the scene with a cold, simmering fury that was far more terrifying than any loud explosion of rage. The bodies of his 3 guards had been laid out in a neat, grim row. Their expressions were frozen in masks of surprise, their throats opened with a single, brutally efficient slash. There was no sign of a struggle. It was the work of a phantom. His buyers, the men who had paid good money for the women, were gathered around him, their voices a low, angry buzz. The brutish rancher, Hank, his face mottled with rage, jabbed a thick finger at Croft. "This is your doing, Croft," he bellowed. "Your security is a joke. I paid $200 for that little Spitfire." Croft slowly turned his head, and his dead, black eyes fixed on Hank. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His whisper was colder than a grave. "Are you questioning my professional capabilities, Hank?" The rancher, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back. Everyone in Perdition knew that while Croft might look like a scarecrow, he had the heart of a rattlesnake. "All I'm saying is," Hank stammered, "we want our property back. Or our money." "Oh, you'll get your property back," Croft said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his thin lips. "And I'll throw in the years of the man who did this as a bonus. This wasn't some drunken squabble. Look at this work." He gestured with a long, bony finger at the clean cuts on the dead men. "This was Apache." A nervous murmur went through the small crowd. The name was a curse in these parts, a name that conjured images of ghost-like raiders and sudden, violent death. "One Apache," Croft continued, his voice hardening. "One man did this. And he took 3 unarmed women. Why? Not for ransom. They don't work that way." This was a statement. An insult. His gaze drifted towards the jagged silhouette of the Dragon Mountains. "And I do not suffer insults lightly." Croft was more than just a purveyor of human misery. He was a master of his Vol trade. And that trade required a certain set of skills, chief among them being the ability to track. He had spent years in the territory, learning the ways of the land, learning how to read the subtle signs that a man or a woman left behind. His reputation, and his profits, were on the line. He assembled his posse not from the drunken rabble of the town, but from a handful of men as cold and as ruthless as himself. There was a weary, silent man named Reno, a former army scout who had been dishonorably discharged for brutality and whose eyes were as empty and as pitiless as blue glass. And there were the Calloway brothers, Zeke and Jeb, a pair of hulking, slow-witted thugs who lived for violence and followed Croft with a dog-like devotion. It was a small group, but it was deadly. By sunrise, they were on the trail. Croft was a bloodhound in human form. He moved with a hunched, loping gait, his eyes scanning the ground, missing nothing. He found the women's tracks leading away from the town, 3 sets of barefoot prints, confused and panicked at first, then falling into a more desperate, determined line. They're heading for the dragoons, Reno observed, his voice a dry rasp. Amateurs. They'll be dead from thirst by noon. Don't underestimate them, Croft said, a flicker of something almost like respect in his tone. He pointed to a place where the tracks diverged around a patch of thorny chala cactus instead of going through it. They're not panicked anymore. They're thinking. Especially the teacher. She's the smart one. The hunt became a grim, relentless pursuit. Croft and his men were mounted, their horses easily covering the ground that the women had toiled over on foot. They found the remains of the barrel cactus the women had opened, and Croft let out a dry chuckle. Clever girl, he muttered to himself. They followed the tracks to the wash, their horses picking their way through the sandy bottom. They found the small pool where the women had drunk and the signs of their brief rest. Croft was like a predator scenting his prey, his excitement growing with every sign, every clue. He was enjoying this. The hunt was always the best part. Then they saw the signs of the flash flood. The trail vanished, washed away by the torrent of muddy water. The Calloway brothers grumbled in frustration, but Croft was unfazed. He dismounted and began to walk the edge of the wash, his eyes scanning the high ground. It took him nearly an hour, but he found what he was looking for, a single, faint footprint in a patch of damp earth on a ledge 50 feet above the canyon floor. It was a small, barely perceptible sign, but to Croft, it was a shout. "They're alive," he announced, a triumphant glint in his eyes. They got to high ground. They're smart, and they're lucky. But their luck is about to run out. The women, miles ahead, were unaware of how close their pursuers were, but they could feel it. It was a prickling sensation on the back of their necks, a feeling of being watched. They pushed themselves relentlessly, their bodies aching, their feet wry and bleeding. The initial bond forged in the face of natural danger was now solidified by the shared terror of the human threat that trailed them. One afternoon, as they were resting in a narrow, rocky canyon, Laura was climbing to a high point to scout the path ahead. She lay flat on a sun-warmed slab of rock and peered back the way they had come. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the desert floor. And then she saw it. A small cloud of dust in the distance, a cloud that was moving to deliberately, to purposefully, to be caused by the wind. Her blood ran cold. She slid back down the rock, her face pale. "They're coming," she said, her voice a tight, breathless whisper. For riders. The hunter's shadow had fallen over them. There was no more illusion of escape, no more pretending they were simply lost. They were prey, and the wolves were closing in. Their only hope was to climb higher, to push deeper into the unforgiving mountains, into the heart of the Apache's land, praying they could lose the monsters behind them before they ran into whatever lay ahead. The game of survival had become a deadly race. The knowledge that they were being actively hunted changed the dynamic of their flight. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. They abandoned any semblance of a direct path, scrambling through treacherous, rocky terrain that would be difficult for horses to navigate. Their only thought to put as much distance and as many obstacles as possible between themselves and the dust cloud on the horizon. They climbed higher into the dragoons, the landscape becoming a labyrinth of canyons, sheer cliffs, and forests of pippin and juniper. The air grew cooler, but the terrain became more demanding. 2 days after spotting their pursuers, they were on the verge of collapse. Their makeshift shoes were in tatters, their bodies were a mass of cuts and bruises, and a gnawing hunger had settled deep in their bellies. Sarah, weakened by malnourishment, stumbled and fell, her energy finally depleted. "I can't," she sobbed, curling into a ball on the dusty ground. "I can't go on." Laura and Maria knelt beside her, their own faces etched with exhaustion. They had reached their limit. Just as despair began to set in, Maria, who had been scanning their surroundings with a desperate intensity, let out a small gasp. "Look," she whispered, pointing. Through a gap in the trees, on a distant, sun-drenched mesa, they could just make out the shape of a small, adobe building with a cross on its roof. A mission. It was a symbol of civilization, a promise of sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness. It was a miracle. The sight of it gave them the last burst of strength they needed. Half carrying Sarah between them, they began the arduous trek towards the mission. It took them the better part of the afternoon, and when they finally stumbled into the small, sun-cracked courtyard, they were a pitiful sight. The mission was old, its adobe walls crumbling, its wooden bell tower silent and empty. It seemed, at first glance, to be abandoned. But then a small, stooped figure emerged from the cool darkness of the chapel. He was an old man, a priest, with a halo of wispy white hair and a face so deeply lined it looked like a map of the very land he inhabited. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear, and they held a deep, weary kindness. He showed no surprise at their appearance, as if 3 desperate, half-starved women appearing out of the wilderness was a common occurrence. He simply beckoned them inside. "Come, my children," he said, his voice a soft, gentle rasp. "You are weary. Come and rest." His name was Padre Miguel, and he was the mission's sole inhabitant. He led them into a small, clean room with 3 simple cots, and brought them water, goat cheese, and hard, stale bread that tasted like the most exquisite feast they had ever eaten. He tended to their wounds with a practiced hand, his touch gentle, his presence calming. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were safe. That evening, as they sat in the mission's small, candlelit chapel, the cool, quiet space a balm to their frayed nerves, they told him their story. They told him of the auction and perdition, of their terrifying escape, and of the silent, painted warrior who had freed them. Padre Miguel listened patiently, his head bowed, his hands steepled before him. When they finished, he was silent for a long time. "You have been touched by the Ndiji," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ghost warrior." The women exchanged confused glances. "He is a legend in these parts," the old priest continued, his eyes seeming to look at something far away. "A story the old ones tell. For years, he has been a protector of the innocent, a spirit of vengeance who strikes against those who bring evil to this land." Men like Silas Croft. The name sent a shiver through them. "You know Croft?" Hilar asked. Padre Miguel's kind face hardened. "I know of him. He is a sickness, a poison that seeps into the land. The ghost warrior, he is the cure. He appears when the injustice is greatest, strikes with the speed of a striking hawk, and then vanishes back into the mountains. No one knows who he is, or where he comes from. Some say he is the last of a lost clan, a man who carries the ghosts of his slaughtered people on his shoulders. Others say he is not a man at all, but a spirit, the embodiment of the mountain's anger." This new information deepened the mystery of their rescuer. He was not just a random Apache warrior, he was a legend, a mythical figure. It explained the almost supernatural way he had moved, the impossible silence of his attack. "Why did he help us?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "We are white. The ghost warrior does not see the color of a person's skin, my child," the priest said gently. "He sees only the color of their soul. He sees the victim and the oppressor, the innocent and the guilty. He saved you because you were in need of saving. But he left you to fend for yourselves for a reason." "A reason?" Maria scoffed, a flash of her old fire returning. "He left us to die." "No," Padre Miguel said, shaking his head. "He left you to live, to find your own strength. The wilderness does not suffer the weak. He was testing you, seeing if you were worthy of the life he had returned to you. The fact that you are here proves that you are." A comfortable silence fell as they absorbed his words. The priest's explanation cast their ordeal in a new light. It had not been a random act of cruelty, but a test, a trial by fire. Their respite, however, was to be short-lived. Padre Miguel's face grew grim. "You have found sanctuary here, but it is only temporary. Croft is a relentless man. He will not give up his hunt easily. He knows these mountains, and he will eventually find his way here. This mission is no fortress. You cannot stay." His words extinguished the fragile flame of hope that had been kindled in their hearts. They were still being hunted. The shadow was still out there, drawing ever closer. But now, they had a new piece to the puzzle. They were not just running from a monster. They were following the trail of a ghost, a mysterious protector whose motives were as enigmatic as the rugged, ancient mountains he called home. And they began to realize that finding him might be their only true path to salvation. The sanctuary of the mission, though temporary, was a desperately needed reprieve. For 3 days, Under the gentle care of Padre Miguel, the women rested and healed. The simple, repetitive chores of mission life, tending the small garden, milking the single goat, grinding corn for tortillas, helped to ground them, to pull their minds away from the constant, gnawing fear. Their physical wounds began to close, and with them, some of the deeper, emotional scars started to mend. They began to talk, truly talk, sharing stories of the lives that had been stolen from them, their shared trauma forging a bond that was now as strong as steel. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, while sitting in the shade of the courtyard and mending their tattered clothes with needle and thread provided by the priest, that Alara's analytical mind began to work. She closed her eyes, forcing her memory back to the terrifying, chaotic moments in the shed in perdition. She had been a schoolteacher, trained to observe, to notice details, to find patterns. She filtered out the fear, the darkness, the confusion, and focused on the tangible. "The knife," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. "The knife he gave me." Maria and Sarah looked at her. She had kept the weapon with her constantly, a talisman of their unlikely freedom. She drew it now, its steel blade glinting in the afternoon sun. "I was so scared, I barely looked at it," she admitted. "But I felt it. There was something on the hilt." She ran her thumb over the worn leather wrapping of the handle. There, pressed into the hardened leather just below the hilt, was a small, distinct symbol. It was a simple, elegant design, a circle with a single, stylized eagle feather cutting across it at a diagonal. It was a mark of ownership, a maker's mark, or something more. At that same moment, Sarah, who had been quietly stitching a patch onto her dress, went very still. "The bird call," she whispered, her voice so soft they had to lean in to hear. "What bird call?" Maria asked. "That night just before he appeared," Sarah explained, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "I heard a bird. It was late, too late for most birds to be singing. It was a strange call, one I'd never heard before on the homestead. It sounded like," she paused, trying to replicate the sound, a series of 3 short, sharp whistles followed by a longer, more mournful cry. A flicker of recognition crossed Maria's face. "The cry of the hawk," she said, "but different, changed." That evening, they showed the symbol on the knife to Padre Miguel. He held it close to the candlelight, his old eyes squinting at the mark. He traced its shape with a gnarled finger, a look of profound surprise on his face. "I have not seen this mark in 30 years, he murmured, his voice filled with a strange awe. "It is the symbol of the Jiu clan of the Karikahua, the people of the rising sun." They were a small, proud family group who lived deep within the Dragon Mountains. Fierce warriors, but peaceful keepers of the old ways. "Lived?" Alara asked, her heart sinking. "As in, past tense." The priest nodded sadly. "There was a massacre. A cavalry patrol, acting on false information about a raid, tracked them to their winter camp. They attacked at dawn. Very few were said to have escaped. Most believe the clan was wiped out completely." The pieces began to click into place. Their rescuer wasn't just a ghost, he was a survivor, perhaps one of the last of his people. This wasn't just a quest for revenge against men like Croft, it was a private, lonely war waged by a man who had lost everything. The thought was both tragic and terrifying. "And the bird call?" Sarah asked timidly, describing the sound she had heard. Padre Miguel's eyes lit up. "A signal. The mountains are full of echoes. A shout can travel for miles, betraying your position. But a bird call, it is the language of the wilderness. It is a sound that belongs. To an outsider, it is nothing. But to someone who is listening for it, it carries a message. A warning. An all clear." He looked at them, his expression grim. He was not alone that night. He had a lookout. The revelation sent a chill down their spines. The raid had not been the impulsive act of a single warrior, but a planned, coordinated attack. Their ghost had allies. He had a clan that was supposed to be extinct. "If his people are still alive," Alara said, her mind racing with the implications, "where would they be?" "The Dragoons are a fortress," Padre Miguel explained, gesturing towards the vast, shadowy mountain range that loomed over them. "They are a maze of canyons and hidden valleys. There is a place the old maps call Kochai's stronghold, a natural citadel of rock. If a man wanted to disappear, if a people wanted to hide from the world, that is where they would go." Suddenly, they had more than just a vague hope. They had a destination. They had a trail of clue, as a symbol, bird call, and name. They were no longer just running from Silas Croft. They were running to the ghost warrior. The mystery of their rescuer was beginning to unravel, and they sensed that finding him, finding the last of the people of the rising sun, was their only hope for finding a true and lasting sanctuary. The decision was made in the silent, candlelit chapel. They would not wait for Croft to find them. They would leave at dawn and head for the mountains, following the ghost trail. Their plan to leave at dawn was shattered by the harsh clang of the mission's old, cracked bell. It was rung not by Padre Miguel, but by a frantic, pulling rope in the pre-dawn darkness, a discordant, panicked alarm. The priest burst into their room, his face pale in the flickering light of the lamp he carried. "He is here," he said, his voice a grim, urgent whisper. "Croft. His men are at the mouth of the valley." He had been watching, the old priest explained. Every night since their arrival, he had kept a lonely vigil from the bell tower, his old eyes scanning the approaches to his isolated sanctuary. He had seen the flicker of a campfire where none should be, a single, telltale sign that the hunter had found his prey's hiding place. Panic, cold and sharp, seized them. They were trapped. The mission, which had felt like a fortress of solitude, now felt like a fragile cage. "The back wall of the chapel," the priest said quickly, his mind surprisingly sharp and decisive in the crisis. "There is a loose stone behind the altar. It leads to an old irrigation ditch. It is mostly collapsed, but it will take you 100 yards, to the base of the cliff. From there, you must climb. Follow the goat path. It will lead you to the high country." It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was the only one they had. As Maria and Sarah gathered their meager belongings, knife, a small pouch of ground corn, 2 gourds of water, Laura grabbed the priest's arm. "Come with us," she pleaded. "You can't stay here. He'll know you helped us." A sad, gentle smile touched Padre Miguel's lips. "This mission is my home, my child. It is my post. I will not abandon it." He pressed a small, worn crucifix into her hand. "Go, and may God go with you. Now hurry. I will buy you what time I can." They scrambled into the chapel. Behind the simple stone altar, they found the loose stone, just as he described. Prying it open revealed a dark, narrow opening that smelled of damp earth and decay. Without a moment's hesitation, Maria slid into the darkness. Sarah followed, her fear palpable but her trust in her companions absolute. Ilara was the last to go, pausing for a moment to look back at the old priest. He stood in the doorway of his chapel, a solitary, defiant figure, a shepherd preparing to face the wolves. The irrigation ditch was a tight, claustrophobic tunnel. They crawled on their hands and knees, the rough-hewn stone scraping their skin. It felt like being buried alive. After what seemed like an eternity, they emerged into the cool, gray air of dawn, at the base of a sheer rock face. Above them, a narrow, treacherous path goat trail snaked its way up the cliff. Just as they started to climb, they heard shouts from the mission. Croft's net had closed. Silas Croft and his men rode into the mission courtyard with their guns drawn. They found Padre Miguel standing calmly before the chapel doors, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his brown cassock. "Where are they, old man?" Croft snarled, dismounting and striding towards him, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. "They are gone," the priest replied, his voice steady. "Fled into the arms of God's wilderness." Croft backhanded him across the face, a vicious blow that sent the old man stumbling back against the heavy wooden doors. "I am not a patient man, Padre. I know they were here. My tracker, Reno, found their tracks leading right to your door. Now, for the last time, where did they go?" "I am a servant of the Lord," Padre Miguel said, dabbing a trickle of blood from his lip. "I offer sanctuary to all who are in need. I do not ask questions, and I do not betray their trust." Zeke Calloway laughed, a brutish, ugly sound. "Maybe we ought to burn this old church down around his ears, boss." Croft smiled, a cold, reptilian twisting of his lips. "A fine idea, Zeke." But first his eyes fell on the still swinging bell rope. Someone had been in the tower. He sent Reno to investigate. High on the cliff face, the women could hear the shouts, could see the tiny figures of the men in the courtyard below. They climbed with a desperate, lung-burning urgency, their fingers raw, their muscles screaming. They knew that their lives depended on every foot of elevation they could gain. Reno returned from the tower, his face grim. "They're on the cliff," he announced, pointing. "There's a goat trail. They can't have gotten far." Croft's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the rock face. For a moment, he saw them, three small, scrambling figures against the vast expanse of stone. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon, and a puff of dust erupted from the rock just inches from Alara's head. They flattened themselves against the cliff, their hearts hammering. They were completely exposed. Down below, Padre Miguel saw what was happening. He knew the women needed more time. In a final, desperate act of sacrifice, he did the only thing he could. He lunged forward, grabbing the reins of Croft's horse, a wild, defiant cry on his lips. "Run, my children!" he shouted up at the cliff. "Run!" The horse reared in panic. Croft, thrown off balance, snarled in rage. "Get him off!" Jeb Calloway, acting on pure, brutal instinct, raised his pistol and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed courtyard. Padre Miguel crumpled to the ground, his last act a selfless, defiant diversion. The momentary chaos was all the women needed. They scrambled over a ridge, out of the line of fire, and disappeared from view. Croft stared down at the body of the old priest, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been delayed, outwitted. The sacrifice had cost him his prize. "Find another way up," he commanded, his voice a low, deadly hiss. "They will not escape me again. I'll chase them to the gates of hell if I have to." The vulture's net had been torn, but the hunter was more determined than ever. He had tasted blood now, and his thirst for vengeance had become an all-consuming fire. For the women, the sanctuary had become a tomb for their protector, and his sacrifice had sealed their resolve. They were no longer just running for their lives, they were running to honor the memory of the brave old man who had died for them. The death of Padre Miguel was a turning point. It extinguished the last vestiges of hope they had for a simple escape or a return to their old lives. The priest's sacrifice had bought their freedom, and they now carried the weight of that debt. Their flight was no longer just about survival. It was about honoring his memory, about ensuring his death was not in vain. This new, grim purpose settled into their bones, hardening their resolve, transforming them from frightened fugitives into determined pilgrims on a desperate quest. The high country of the Dragoon Mountains was a different world. The oppressive heat of the low desert gave way to a crisp, thin air that smelled of pine and damp earth. The landscape was a vertical, unforgiving maze of granite spires, deep-wooded canyons, and treacherous slopes of loose rock called scree. It was a land of breathtaking beauty and imminent danger. Their journey became a grueling test of their physical and emotional limits. The goat path saved them from Croft's immediate pursuit, but it led them into a wilderness more profound and more challenging than anything they had yet faced. Their food was gone in a day. The gourds of water were soon empty. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion, and thirst a maddening torment. It was Sarah, the quiet homesteader's daughter, who began to come into her own. The trauma that had silenced her for so long was slowly being replaced by the deep, instinctual knowledge of the land her father had taught her. She recognized the hardy pippin pines and showed them how to harvest the small, nutritious nuts from the cones. She found a small, hidden spring bubbling up from beneath a moss-covered rock, a source of pure, cold water that felt like a gift from heaven. She moved through the wilderness with a quiet confidence, her senses alive to the subtle signs of the natural world. She was no longer the fragile, broken girl from the auction block. She was a daughter of the frontier, and this harsh land, in a strange way, was her element. Maria, too, found her role. Her spirit, which had been so fiery and defiant, now became a wellspring of indomitable optimism. When Alara's logical mind succumbed to despair at the sheer impossibility of their situation, it was Maria who would sing a song from her village, a simple, haunting melody that lifted their spirits. When Sarah's quiet strength wavered, it was Maria who would put a supportive arm around her, whispering words of encouragement in a soothing mix of Spanish and English. She was the heart of their small, desperate band, the keeper of the flame of their hope. Alara remained their strategist. Every morning, she would climb to a high point and map out their route for the day, her mind constantly calculating, assessing risks, planning their path towards the area Padre Miguel had called Cocha's stronghold. She rationed their meager food supplies, pushed them to rest when they were on the verge of collapse, and drove them onward when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. The knife their mysterious savior had given them was her constant companion, a tool she used to cut branches for shelter, to dig for edible roots, and to defend them against a prowling mountain lion one terrifying night. Her screams and the flashing blade just enough to drive the beast back into the shadows. One evening, huddled together for warmth beside a small, smokeless fire, Sarah finally spoke of the night her family was killed. The words came out in a halting, painful rush, the memories like shards of glass. Alara and Maria didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. They simply listened, their silent presence a testament of shared suffering, a powerful acknowledgement of her pain. In that moment of shared grief, their bond was irrevocably sealed. They were no longer three strangers thrown together by fate. They were sisters, forged in the crucible of loss and survival. They found signs that they were on the right path. High on a windswept ridge, etched into the weathered bark of an ancient, gnarled juniper tree, was the symbol from the warrior's knife, the circle, and the eagle feather. Seeing it sent a jolt of renewed hope through them. He was real. His people were real. They were not just chasing a ghost story. They were following a trail. But Croft was never far behind. He was a creature of singular, obsessive purpose. He and his men found a way up the cliffs and followed the women into the high country. They were not as adept in this terrain, their progress slower, their horses a hindrance in the steep, rocky canyons. But they were relentless. The women would often see them, tiny figures far below, a constant, menacing reminder that the past was not yet done with them. The mountain's final test came in the form of a narrow, windswept pass that the locals called the Devil's Spine. It was a knife-edge ridge with a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on either side. A fierce, relentless wind threatened to tear them from their precarious footing. To cross it was an act of pure, terrifying will. It was there that they were finally cornered. As they reached the middle of the pass, they saw them. Croft and Reno had abandoned their horses and climbed up from the other side, blocking their path. Behind them, the Calloway brothers were closing in. They were trapped, caught between two sets of killers, with nothing but empty air on either side. The hunter's shadow had finally become the hunter's trap. There was nowhere left to run. The mountain had tested them, and in this final, desperate moment, it would judge them. The wind howled across the Devil's Spine, a mournful, shrieking cry that seemed to echo the hopelessness of their situation. They were trapped. Before them stood Silas Croft and the silent tracker, Reno, their figures dark silhouettes against the gray and forgiving sky. Behind them, the heavy, labored breathing of the Calloway brothers signaled the closing of the trap. End of the line, ladies, Croft called out, his voice thin and sharp in the wind. A triumphant, cruel smile stretched his lips. I have to admire your spirit. You've led me on a merry chase. But the fun is over. Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze them. This was it, the end of their desperate flight. But then Alara looked at Maria's defiant face, at Sarah's quiet, steely resolve. They had not come this far, survived this much, only to die on this miserable ridge. The memory of Padre Miguel's sacrifice, of the kindness in his eyes, flashed in her mind. They would not let his death be for nothing. We don't have to make it easy for them, Alara said, her voice low but steady, her knuckles white as she gripped the Apache's knife. A change came over them. The hunted became defenders. Acting on pure instinct and Alara's quick commands, they began to use the terrain, their only ally. They kicked at loose stones, sending small, clattering landslides down towards the advancing Calloway brothers, forcing them to slow their approach. Sarah, her eyes sharp, pointed out a large, precariously balanced boulder near the edge of the path. It was a desperate, flimsy defense, but it was something. Give it up, Croft sneered, taking a step forward. There's nowhere to run. It was then that a new sound joined the howling of the wind. It was a bird call. 3 short, sharp whistles, followed by a long, mournful cry. The call of the hawk. Croft and his men froze, their eyes darting round in confusion. They knew that sound. They had heard whispers of it. To them, it was a death knell. And then he appeared. He was not a ghost this time. He rose from behind a rock formation on the ridge above them, as if conjured from the stone itself. He was no longer just a shadow, he was a warrior. His face was painted not for stealth, but for war, stark lines of black and white that gave him a terrifying, otherworldly appearance. In his hands, he held a short, powerful Apache bow, an arrow already knocked to the string. The single eagle feather in his hair whipped in the wind. He was not alone. On the ridges on either side of the pass, other figures rose, warriors painted like their leader, their bows drawn and ready. The hunters had become the hunted. The trap had been turned. Croft's face, a moment before triumphant, contorted into a mask of rage and disbelief. He raised his rifle towards the lead warrior, but he was too late. An arrow, silent and impossibly fast, flew from the warrior's bow and struck the rifle from his hands, the impact sending a numbing shock through his arms. Chaos erupted. Arrows rained down on the pass, silent, deadly messengers of retribution. Jeb Calloway screamed as an arrow pierced his shoulder, and he staggered back, losing his footing on the narrow ledge. He flailed for a moment, his eyes wide with terror, and then tumbled over the edge, his scream swallowed by the vast, empty air. Zeke Calloway, roaring in rage and panic, charged forward, firing his pistol wildly. Mario, in an act of pure and thinking courage, shoved Alara and Sarah behind the large boulder just as Zeke's bullet ricocheted off the rock where they had been standing. The lead warrior, who the women now knew was Nanton, the last chief of the Ja clan, dropped from the ridge above, landing on the path with the silent grace of a mountain cat. He moved with a speed that was almost a blur, his long knife, a mate to the one he had given Alara, now in his hand. He met Zeke's charge not with brute force, but with a fluid, deadly grace, deflecting the man's clumsy attack and ending the fight with a single, swift, and final strike. Reno, the silent tracker, drew two long knives of his own, his face a mask of cold concentration. He and Nanton circled each other, a deadly dance on the knife edge of the world. But Reno was an outsider here. Nanton was a part of the mountain itself. The fight was brutally short. Nanton was not just a warrior, he was an artist of violence, and his art was fatal. Now, only Croft was left. He stood alone, an armed surrounded. The vulture was caged. Nanton approached him slowly, his face unreadable behind the mask of paint. He did not raise his knife. He simply stood before the man who had caused so much suffering, his presence an overwhelming force of silent judgment. Croft, stripped of his weapons and his thugs, was just a monogaunt, pathetic, terrified man. He backed away, his eyes wild with fear, until his heels were at the very edge of the cliff. He stumbled, and with a final, pathetic shriek, he was gone, his evil finally and irrevocably swallowed by the mountain. Silence fell on the devil's spine, the only sound the relentless, cleansing wind. The Apache warriors lowered their bows. Nanton turned to the three women who huddled behind the boulder. He walked towards them, and for the first time, they saw his eyes clearly. They were dark and filled with a profound, ancient sadness, but they also held a flicker of something else, respect. He stopped before them and looked at the knife in Alara's hand. Then he looked at their faces, at the grime, the bruises, the exhaustion, but also at the unbreakable strength in their eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. They had been tested, and they had not been found wanting. He finally spoke, his voice a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. It was the first time they had ever heard it. "You fought," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of honor. The ghost had returned, not as a savior descending from on high, but as an ally, a warrior who had come to fight alongside the women who had proven they were strong enough to fight for themselves. Nanton and his warriors led them away from the devil's spine, away from the scene of violent retribution, taking a hidden path that seemed to materialize out of the solid rock face. The trail led them into a narrow, winding canyon, its entrance so cleverly concealed by a waterfall and a tangle of ancient trees that no outsider would ever find it. After a final, steep climb, the canyon opened up into a hidden valley, a bowl of impossible green nestled in the heart of the granite mountains. It was a place of profound peace and staggering beauty. A clear stream snaked through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. Small, well-tended fields of corn and squash grew in the fertile soil. Tucked against the far cliff wall were a dozen or so wickiups, the traditional dome-shaped dwellings of the Apache, smoke curling lazily from their smoke holes. This was it, the home of the Ja clan, the sanctuary of the people of the rising sun. The people who emerged from the wickiups were not the fearsome specters of settler nightmares, but a small, resilient community. There were women, children, and old men, their faces proud and dignified. They were the survivors, the last remnants of a people who had refused to be erased, who had carved out a life in this secret place, hidden from a world that had tried to destroy them. They greeted Nanton and his warriors with a quiet, solemn respect, their eyes filled with questions as they looked upon the three strange women they had brought with them. In the days that followed, the women were given a wickiup of their own and were treated with a gentle, cautious kindness. They were given food, clean clothes of soft deerskin, and salves for their wounds. Their story was told around the central campfire, not by them, but by Nanton. He spoke in the lyrical, flowing Apache tongue, but they could understand the meaning from his gestures, from the reactions of the people. He spoke of the auction, of their courage, of their desperate journey through the mountains, and of their final, defiant stand on the ridge. He spoke of them not as victims he had rescued, but as warriors who had earned their place here. Nanton finally came to speak with them alone, sitting with them at the entrance to their dwelling as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and rose. The war paint was gone, revealing the face of a man in his prime, a face that was handsome, but etched with the deep lines of grief and responsibility. "My father was the chief of our people," he explained, his English measured and thoughtful, learned from a missionary in his youth. He believed in peace, in finding a way to live with the white man. He was wrong. He stared into the distance, his eyes seeing the ghosts of the past. The soldiers came at dawn. I was young, away on my first solo hunt. When I returned there was only smoke and silence. I found the few who had hidden and survived, and I led them here, to this place my grandfather had told me of. We have been here ever since. The ghost warrior, Alara said softly. He nodded. Men like Croft, they are a disease. They poison everything they touch. I could not stand by and let their sickness spread without a fight. I strike, and I disappear. It is the only way to protect my people. To let the world believe we are all gone. You tested us, Maria stated, her gaze direct. You left us in the desert. I did, Nanton admitted, meeting her gaze without flinching. I had to know what was in your hearts. The wilderness strips away all lies. It reveals the truth of a person. I saw you were not weak. I saw you had the will to live, to fight. I tracked you. I was never far. When you were truly in danger, when you could go no further on your own, I was there. He offered them a choice. They could stay here, in this hidden valley, and become part of the Ja clan, a people who valued courage and resilience above all else. Or, his warriors would guide them safely to the nearest civilized town, far from the memory of perdition, where they could attempt to start their lives anew. For a long time, the three women sat in silence, each contemplating the paths that lay before them. They had been forged into a family by the trail, and the thought of separating was painful. But they knew that each of them had to follow the path that was true to their own spirit. Maria, the daughter of the desert, was the first to decide. She had found a kinship here, a connection to a people who lived in harmony with the land she understood so well. She would stay. She would learn their language, their ways, and her fiery spirit would find a home among the proud, defiant people of the rising sun. Sarah, who had lost one family to the brutality of the frontier, found a quiet peace in the valley that she had never known. The world outside held only ghosts and painful memories. Here, among the whispering pines and the silent, watchful mountains, she could heal. She, too, would stay. It was Alara who chose the other path. I am a teacher, she said, her voice filled with a new, powerful sense of purpose. My fight isn't with a knife in the mountains. It's with books and words. I have to go back. I have to tell your story. I have to tell our story. I have to make sure that people know what men like Croft are doing in the dark corners of this land. Padre Miguel died for us. I can't let his sacrifice be forgotten. Nanton looked at her, and in his eyes, there was a deep and profound understanding. He, the warrior who fought in the shadows, and she, the teacher who would fight in the light, were two sides of the same coin. The farewell was emotional, a bittersweet parting of the sisters of the trail. Alara promised she would never reveal the location of their sanctuary. 2 weeks later, guided by two of Nanton's silent warriors, Alara rode into the town of Tucson. She was no longer the frightened, captive schoolteacher. She was a woman of immense strength and unwavering purpose. The legend of the Midnight Raid would continue to be whispered around campfires, a tale of a mysterious Apache warrior who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. But Alar knew the truth. The story wasn't about a phantom savior. It was about three ordinary women who, when faced with the worst of humanity, discovered the extraordinary strength within themselves. And it was about a chief who fought a lonely war to protect his people, the man who understood that sometimes the greatest act of strength is not just to fight, but to inspire others to find the courage to fight for themselves.